Chapter 6, Ancient and Modern Prophecies of the Millennium. Edgar Cayce was not alone in prophesizing about the coming millennium. Psychics and seers of other times and cultures came before him to make similar prophecies, although we have no reason to suspect that the waking Cayce ever knew of them. The correspondences among these independent sources are compelling. It is not enough evidence to claim any sort of proof, because who can ever prove the future? But it does suggest that we should explore seriously these visions of the future. Many ancient and modern sources echo the same themes about what the millennium will bring. This chapter samples a variety of prophetic traditions and modern-day visionaries, whose predictions are close parallels to the ones given by Cayce. The prophecies mentioned in this chapter come from Nostradamus, Native American people, i.e. Mayans, Aztecs, and Hopis, the visions of near-death experiences, and two contemporary visionaries. Nostradamus. The psychic most often compared to Cayce was the Frenchman Michael de Notre Dame, better known by the Latinized form of the name which he adopted upon university graduation. Nostradamus, born in 1503, Nostradamus, like Edgar Cayce, was deeply committed to compassionate service and healing in his adult career, whereas Cayce was relatively unschooled and approached healing as a clairvoyant diagnostician. Nostradamus was a trained physician. He gained some notoriety for his skills helping victims of the plague to regain health. But it was not his medical skill that made him famous throughout Europe. After 20 years of medical practice in 1550, he published the first of his books that combined useful daily knowledge with predictive insights, largely based on astrology. These almanac-like volumes appeared annually for 16 years. During this second phase of his professional career, he also published a book of home remedies, again, like Cayce, whose own home remedy suggestions have been published in several forms. By far the most of Nostradamus' publications is a collection of visionary poems that first appeared between 1555 and 1558 and have stayed in print continuously for over 400 years. Entitled Centuries, they were published as a series of books, each with 100 quatrains, hence the title. However, some people have assumed that these collections of prophetic poems were titled so as to imply that they look centuries into the future. Perhaps Nostradamus intended the ambiguity. Like Cayce, Nostradamus was sought after in his own times. On 2 occasions, the Queen of France requested his predictive advice. Politicians and businessmen from all over Europe knew of his reputation and wrote for counsel. Before starting new enterprises, it was not merely in retrospect that these two men gained appreciation and notoriety. In spite of their common reputation as prophets, there are many significant differences between Cayce and Nostradamus which make it hard to portray accurately the similarities in their visions of the 21st century. Perhaps most notably, the prophecies of Nostradamus are cloaked in astrological imagery, symbolism, and vague references, which may be difficult for a person of our times ever to decipher. Although Cayce's language is no doubt difficult for most people to get used to, his predictions for the millennium are in many cases straightforward. Consider one example presented in Chapter 2. Repeatedly, Cayce said that the years 1958 to 1998 would be the 4 decades in which extraordinary planetary transformation would begin. The dates are clear and unambiguous. Not so with the quatrains of Nostradamus. They required interpretation from the time they were given, and that process continued after his death in 1594, just 28 years after Nostradamus' death. The first published interpretations appeared since then. Dozens of writers have attempted to unravel the meaning behind the enigmatic pronouncements of centuries. Some of the predictions in his quatrains seem unarguably accurate, particularly some that were fulfilled in his own century. For example, 4 years before the death of King Henry II in a jousting mishap, Nostradamus' predictive poem foreshadowed the sad event with details that proved to be valid. The young lion shall overcome the old one. In a martial field by a single duel, in a golden cage he shall put out his eye. 2 wounds from one, then he shall die a cruel death. But unfortunately, very few of the quatrains can be linked so specifically to historical events. Ambiguity and multiple possible meanings for various symbols make it very hard to say exactly what Nostradamus predicted, especially in regard to our upcoming millennium. Critics go so far as to say that trying to make sense of centuries is like a Rorschach inkblot test. They allow interpreters to read into them almost anything they want. These skeptics argue that the imagery and astrological references are often so ambiguous, especially when one has nearly 400 years of history through which to look for coincidental matches, that any claims of prophetic power beyond the 16th century itself are far-fetched. Others who analyze the evidence are more generous in their assessment, pointing out that Nostradamus seems to have had an uncanny ability to foresee air warfare and other aspects of modern life that could hardly have been dreamed of 400 years ago. But there is an unmistakable lack of general agreement among the believers as to exactly what it was that Nostradamus predicted for our own era. Dozens of books in the last 20 years have offered a myriad of interpretations. On one count, however, all seem to agree. Researchers, translators, and scholars of the Nostradamus material all concur that he foresaw cataclysmic changes, even the destruction of the world, but the translations of his poetic imagery into calendar dates range from 1988 to nearly AD 3800. Perhaps the best that can be said of the Nostradamus prophecies when compared to Case is that both predicted the likelihood of global destruction and transformation on a scale far beyond anything else in human history. Nostradamus and Case are not the only psychics who predicted the likelihood of dramatic earth changes. There have been literally dozens of psychics in the years since Case's death who have said similar things, often giving greater details and more specific dates than did Case or clear imagery than Nostradamus ever offered. But in many instances, those specific earth changes predictions have already proved to be incorrect. It is also hard to say to what degree the post-Case psychics were simply mimicking Case, whose influence on the profession of prognostication can hardly be overestimated. No, the case for the study of the Case earth changes readings is not significantly strengthened by psychics who followed him and who have basically reiterated his ideas on the topic. What we need are more sources of information that are likely to be independent of Case, and preferably predate his own work. The best such material comes from other cultural traditions. Native American prophecies. One especially noteworthy source of ancient prophecy about our own times comes from native societies of Central and North America. The Mayan civilization is the most ancient in this part of the world, with the earliest archaeological evidence stretching back to 9000 BC in what is now coastal Belize. By 2500 BC, the Mayans had established agricultural settlements. The key to their success was an elaborate and highly sophisticated set of calendars that allowed for the precise timing of planting and harvesting. These calendars came from many generations of careful observations of the heavens, and they were actually several interlocking measurements of time, each with its own periodicity. The most significant of the Mayan calendars were the solar year of 360 days. divided into 18 months of 20 days each, and the sacred almanac, with 260 days comprised of 13 months of 20 days each. Once every 52 years, a remarkable coincidence occurs as the same day comes up simultaneously on both calendars. This cycle was known as the calendar round and formed the basis of some Indian prophecies, not only Mayan, but the other native cultures of Central and North America who were significantly influenced by the Mayans. Especially significant to a comparison study of cases Millennium predictions is the 400-year cycle the Mayans called Baktuns, and the series of 13 consecutive Baktuns called the Great Cycle. 5,200 years, our current Great Cycle is dated to conclude precisely on December 21st, 2012. Mayan prophecy describes events surrounding this date as rather frightful, but mingled with signs of hope and breakthrough. To the generation that lives during that turning point will come the day of withered fruit. The face of the sun will be extinguished because of the great tempest. But finally there will come blessings to renew humanity. Ornaments shall descend in heaps, and there will be good gifts for one and all. Although not exactly matching the dates that case focused on, nevertheless the themes of painful transition and grace-filled conclusion are embedded in prophetic sources. By the 10th century AD, the sophisticated and impressive centers of Mayan culture were abandoned for reasons that are still relatively mysterious to scholars. Mayan civilization continued, but now at the modest level of village life, and other native civilizations rose in prominence, still highly influenced by many Mayan developments. The Aztecs and Toltecs were two such civilizations. Their culture hero and godlike figure, Quetzalcoatl, was a source of prophecies about changing times. His name roughly translates as Spirit of Light, and he was revered as an ancient teacher of the people in the areas of mathematics, agriculture, theology, and the arts. Legend has it that Quetzalcoatl returned, that is, reincarnated, in a year now calculated to be about AD 947. There is considerable controversy concerning a date for his first incarnation, with some scholars of the opinion that there was no previous lifetime, that any earlier figure was mythological, yet other writers and scholars assert that Quetzalcoatl was a historic character living sometime before Christ. For example, the renowned esoteric philosopher Manly Palmer Hall writes in 12 World Teachers, at some remote time a great initiate king arose among the civilizations of Mexico and Central America. It is impossible at this late date to determine the period during which he lived, but it is safe to say that it was some centuries before the Christian era. In Voices of Earth and Sky, anthropologist Vincent Brown describes the original Quetzalcoatl as the great prophet of the period 200 BC to the beginning of AD. In this second life with his people, Quetzalcoatl foretold many important events and cycles of changes to be experienced in the coming 1,000 years or so. His prophecy stated that within the ongoing fifth age there would be 13 cycles, each comprised of 52 years. During these 676 years there would be decreasing consciousness and free will. Then would come 9 cycles, once again of 52 years each, that would be characterized by darkness or hell. Scholars use the year AD 843 as the starting point of all these cycles, that is, at the end of the classical period of Mayan culture. Quetzalcoatl's reincarnation would have come after 2 of these 52-year cycles had already been accomplished, and some very interesting correspondence can be found to be recorded history. If we look 676 years into the period, that is the full 13 cycles of diminishing consciousness and free will, we see that Cortez arrived in America in 1519 with his armies, and after a brief struggle he conquered and enslaved the people of this region. The year 1935 marks the beginning of the final 52-year cycle of darkness and hell. It is interesting to note that this date marks well the time when Hitler began moves to start World War II. The year 1987, that is, 1935 plus 52, was to be the final one in this last cycle of darkness. Then was to come the Great Purification, reminiscent of Case's vision of global changes. This purification sounds dire. The equipoise of nature will be lost. The ocean tides shall obey no more. Cities and mountains will collapse, leveled by great earthquakes. Although this kind of destruction did not occur in 1987, we are left to wonder if the timing has been delayed, or if human choices may be altering what was once a likely future. Indeed, according to a second prophecy, the intensity of suffering accompanying this purification would depend upon mankind's choices. Despite the intensity of this purification process, the prophecies contain a hopeful view. A new era of cooperation, peace, and plenty will be born. Quetzalcoatl promised to return in the time of the great-great-grandchildren of the white conquerors, initiating a new set of cycles, a golden age of spiritual rebirth, planetary harmony, and for many, the awakened consciousness of the divine life. The Hopi Indians of North America provide another ancient tradition of prophecy that is remarkably parallel to the one given by Edgar Cayce. The immediate ancestors of the Hopi were the ancient ones, the Anasazi, cliff dwellers whose history can be traced back to around 100 BC. By the year AD 500. The Hopi had become a peace-loving agricultural civilization that spread across large portions of what is now the southwest United States. The peak of the Hopi culture was approximately AD 1100, and they constructed impressive buildings at places such as modern-day Mesa Verde, Colorado, and Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. The prophecies of the Hopi are said to have come from Masao, their spiritual teacher for the age. Ancient Hopi prophecies were handed down on stone tablets, accompanied by an oral tradition of interpretation that was passed on by the elders of the community. Certain of these prophecies concern events near the end of this current age in the Hopi framework of history. Some seem to have been fulfilled, including the coming of automobiles and telephones, horseless chariots that would roll along black snakes across the land, and cobwebs through which people would speak over great distances. Among the prophecies is a petroglyph, or rock carving, that depicts the Hopi life plan prophecy. In part, it shows two horizontal timelines, the top one representing our modern technological, materialistic society, and the bottom line depicting the Hopi's own world of attunement to natural forces. Along the materialistic lines are the figures of human beings with their heads detached from their bodies, an apt image for contemporary men and women whose intellectual self and feeling self are so often disassociated. Also shown in this prophetic petroglyph are two vertical lines that connect the horizontal timelines. One of the connecting lines, symbolic of the opportunity for materialistic society to reconnect with the wisdom of the Hopi, is placed chronologically just before a pair of circles, which interpreters deciphered to be the two world wars. The second vertical connector comes after the images for these two great wars at approximately the point in time which we now exist. Thus there is the opportunity, but not the certitude, for technological society to join with the wisdom of the ancient ones. If not, the Hopi life plan prophecy depicts yet another period of great destruction beyond that point on the prophetic carving. The timeline for materialistic society begins to fade out and disappear. The other horizontal timeline, the one that is in harmony with the natural order, continues on. Many Hopi prophecies have seemingly been fulfilled. Trees everywhere will begin dying. People will build a house and throw it into the sky. Perhaps the American space shuttle or the Russian space station. And dramatic changes will occur in the weather. With these signs confirmed, the Hopis believe that they can well expect the next stage in the prophecies, events to take place somewhere around the year 2000. The great day of purification will be traumatic, but it will usher in the next age. Certain cataclysms like war, famine, and earthquakes are predicted, However, their severity is something to be determined by humanity. The Hopi vision of the future includes the option for these catastrophes to be lessened if humankind will work together in the proper spirit. Near-death experiencers as prophets. Another category of visionary is the near-death experiencer. Most research has focused on the remarkable similarities among accounts provided by those who were resuscitated after brief periods of clinical death. Since the publication of Dr. Raymond Moody's bestseller Life After Life and several other comparable books, certain common aspects of the near-death experience have become well known to millions. Going down a tunnel, confronting a review of one's life, encountering a being of light. But what has not been widely reported is that many near-death experiences also have visions of the future during their brief moments in this extraordinary altered state of consciousness. Apparently, the near-death experience does not focus exclusively on one's own personal transition into the spiritual world. At least for some, it also takes on global proportions as one views current planetary conditions and catches glimpses of what may be ahead for humanity. One researcher, Dr. Kenneth Ring of the University of Connecticut, has collected prophetic visionary accounts from several dozen near-death experiencers, which he reported in his 1984 book, Heading Toward Omega. Ring distinguishes more common precognitive material, what he calls personal flash-forwards, from a somewhat rare kind of experience, the prophetic vision. This latter group concerns predictions with a planetary scope. What's more, and this is what makes Ring's research so intriguing, these prophetic visions are highly consistent from person to person. In his systematic assessment of prophetic visions of near-death experiencers, they seem to be seeing the same sort of world about to emerge. Before going into the details of these prophetic visions, it's interesting to note another characteristic that Ring discovered. Most of those who received prophetic visions had the clear sense that they had been shown or told far more than they were able to recall upon resuscitation from the near-death experience. Ring notes several factors that seem to stimulate recall in greater detail months or years later. One, temporal proximity. Some individuals claimed that within a few days of when an event was to occur, the knowledge of its occurrence would resurface. 2. Spatial proximity. For some individuals, being in a certain physical location seemed to trigger a more detailed recall of the prophetic visions they had been given during the near-death experience. 3. Spontaneous recall. For some visionary near-death experiences, details came back to mind several months or years later for no logical reason. Often their own interpretation of such spontaneous recall is that it was simply time for them to have access to the additional knowledge. What, then, did these prophetic visionaries see in the course of their near-death experiences? Ring describes the element of a model to which almost all of them conform. First, the visionary had a sense of being able to see the entirety of the Earth's evolution and history. That is to say, any predictions about specific events were seen in a broader context. In spite of this panoramic view of time, the actual prophetic visions were much more narrow in scope and rarely extended beyond the beginning of the 21st century. The visionaries share a view of the world in chaos as we move toward the end of the 20th century. Massive geophysical changes, huge disturbances in the weather and in food supplies. They see the economic system collapsing and the distinct possibility of nuclear war or accident. And yet, in spite of these dire images, perhaps even more severe than Case's Millennium Prophecies, the near-death visionaries have a collective sense of these changes being for the best. They are merely a very difficult transition into a much more healthy and spiritually enlivened culture in the 21st century. While Ring's research on the one hand seems to corroborate the Case prophecies, there is still one highly significant error on the part of these visionaries. It concerns timing. As Ring himself states in his book published in 1984, while agreeing that the date for these events are not fixed, most individuals feel that they are likely to take place during the 1980s. Most of the visionaries honed in on a date around 1988 or 1989, which surely must be judged now to have been wrong unless we look at some of the prophecies symbolically, and note the sudden and surprising downfall of communism in 1989 and the way that event shook and transformed the world. Ring's book, written when there was still ample time for these prophecies to come true, literally and within the predicted time frame, nevertheless tries to consider the visions from a number of angles. He is quite open to the possibility that the kinds of events described in these prophetic visions will come to pass, even by the end of the 1980s. But as a careful researcher and systematic thinker, Ring also notes that at an individual level, these prophetic visionaries were enduring bodily pain associated with almost dying before their hospital resuscitation and transformation back to life. Their visions for the world reflect the same themes. It is merely one's personal trauma being projected onto the grander canvas of international politics and world geology. Or conversely, does a personal encounter with near death, resuscitation, and transformation make one more sensitive to receive those patterns and possibilities on a global scale? Also noteworthy in Ring's book is a careful consideration of the workings of prediction and precognition. He looks at various models to explain how prophecy is even possible. Ring himself seems to favor a model that draws upon quantum physics and the idea that subatomic processes exist in terms of probabilities. For example, suppose that 3 alternatives exist for how a certain event will turn out. Perhaps alternative A is 70% likely, alternative B 20%, and alternative C 10%. Quantum mechanics suggests that until the event occurs and is observed, each alternative outcome is associated with a wave function. When B is in fact the alternative observed, then the wave functions linked to choice A and C collapse, just as B becomes a certainty. However, another theory of reality suggests that A and C don't disappear. The so-called many worlds interpretations, or the theory of alternative futures, would say that A and C also happen, even if we don't observe them from our perspective in the world where alternative B took place. As Ring notes, this notion is at face value rather outlandish and untestable. Nevertheless, it matches stories that Ring has heard from some of his near-death visionaries who have seen multiple lines of trajectory that lead toward the future. Near the end of heading toward Omega, Ring makes use of this theory of alternative worlds to interpret the prophetic visions of his near-death studies. Ring suggests that his group may have connected with just one of a large set of alternative future scenarios, since they may not have suspected that other scenarios also existed. They had a sense of absolute certitude about what was actually only a probability, perhaps along some other trajectory that is not the one that we're on here in the late 1990s. Those catastrophic events did play themselves out in an alternative world. Admittedly, it is a fanciful and untestable idea, untestable at the least with any methods of investigation we currently understand, but the nature of reality is not limited by our three-dimensional logic. For example, so-called imaginary numbers don't make sense because they depend on the existence of some number multiplied by itself to make -1. Logics say there is no square root of -1, but what happens when we momentarily suspend that objection and theorize such a number, labeling it I for imaginary? That somewhat illogical approach ends up allowing us to solve many complex scientific and engineering problems having to do with the physical world. Maybe just as surely the alternative worlds theory helps us understand the apparent error in the prophetic visions of these near-death experiencers. Visions of a cultural historian. Recognizing historical trends is one tool of the futurist who can extrapolate to create a vision of what might happen. This principle can be applied to major cultural transformations in history. Recurrent themes appear in society's experiences of paradigm shift. Not only can we learn from these historical periods, but we can also formulate predictions of what may lie ahead for us. One especially noteworthy cultural historian who has tried to do this is Dr. William Irvin Thompson, who has taught at MIT, New York University, and Syracuse University. In 1973, he founded the Lindisfarne Association, a contemplative educational community devoted to the study and realization of a new planetary culture. In a number of his books, particularly Darkness and Scattered Light, Thompson examines the alternatives for the future, which he has inferred based on recurrent patterns of major historical change. A summary of his ideas about these times of change fits nicely in our exploration of Millennium Prophecies. In many ways, his theories closely parallel the concepts in the case readings, although they are often much more explicit and detailed regarding a new millennial lifestyle, like the case readings. Thompson sees the latter portion of the 20th century as a period for a paradigm shift at least as great as the Renaissance 500 years ago. In his words, the change will be from civilization to planetization. Civilization is to be understood as a world order that focuses on material production and consumption. Planetization is a world order whose priorities are contemplation, consciousness, and ecological balance. It is not that production and consumption will cease to be relevant issues in a planetized society, but rather we will have new priorities, or in case terminology, new ideals. The particularly difficult times of change which Case foresaw beginning in the period from 1958 to 1998 are designated by Thompson as an initiation period for the Earth. Using the three classic stages of initiation in mystery religions of the past, Thompson provides a framework for viewing both recent current events and predictions about our future. In other words, the ancient concept of spiritual initiation for an individual seeker may be acted out collectively by all of humanity. The traditional challenges and difficulties faced by the individual initiate may be analogous to the ones humanity will confront during these times of testing. Briefly, here are the three primary stages, and in Thompson's interpretation, the way in which we collectively may experience each phase. 1. The illumination of one's darkness or shadow side. The individual initiate might expect to face terrifying images from his own unconscious, the destructive, selfish potential within his own mind. Facing this inner demon can be not only frightening, but also discouraging. There are likely to arise feelings of doubt and unworthiness in seeing this shadow side of ourselves. This testing is felt most acutely by the initiate's ego. When this state is applied to humanity as a whole, it is easy to see examples of the illumination of humanity's dark side, such as the wars in Vietnam, Kuwait, and Bosnia, plus the ecological disasters caused by the misuse of technology. In Thompson's theory, it is especially the elite of society, that is, the ego of a civilization, that experiences the humiliation of this first stage of initiation. 2. Discovery of the edge of one's sanity. For the individual initiate, this is the point at which he realizes that all the old definitions of reality no longer work. The old images of the ego no longer hold together. A breakdown in the sense of oneself and in the sense of reality results. At a collective level, considerable evidence indicates that our society has entered this second stage of testing. The old systems and approaches upon which we used to depend no longer work. Many perplexing national problems seem to have no solution, and so many proposed solutions create even bigger problems while trying to solve the original difficulties. As one editorial in the Washington Post observed, no new ideas are around, and the old ones no longer hold things together like they used to. 3. The defeat of the ego. It is at this point in the individual initiation process that the seeker lets go. In that instant of openness and vulnerability, a new self-identity can be born. Our society has not yet reached this point. It may be years or decades away. As long as the leadership of a society convinces its people that the old ideas and identity might still be made to work again, the courage to surrender and let go will be wanting. These three classic stages of initiation are the archetypes of transformation that historically have been known to only a few. The alchemy of changing consciousness is about to make a quantum leap from the level of the single person to the level of humanity as a whole. As these three stages are enacted for the masses of the planet, Thompson predicts that they will affect different segments of society and different times. In his view, the changes will be felt first in the spiritual/religious community. This is not the group of religious leaders who hold stubbornly to the old paradigm. Rather, it is those who are genuinely open to a mystical revelation of what is being born in the world. Thompson cites Teilhard de Chardin as a good example. The second segment is the artistic community. The new spiritual vision is given new life in art. Through art, a great portion of humanity can sense the imaginative possibilities seen by the mystic. For Thompson, the third segment of society to feel the impact of this new vision is science. Whether it is the architecture of people, like Buckminster Fuller, or mystic physicists like Fritjof Capra, the original vision of the attuned spiritual community finds expression for the masses in science. In fact, many modern physicists sound more like mystics than most ministers and priests of traditional Christianity. The final segment of society to feel the change is the political faction. In effect, the political process is the last area to reflect transformation. It is the hardest to change, the most likely to depict our past rather than our future. In Thompson's view of change, cultural transformation is nearly complete by the time it reaches mainstream politics. In Thompson's writings, we find a description of various cultural forces at work to reshape the planet. One force is the emergent sense of world community. Even if we are not yet able to cooperate very effectively with other nations, the inescapable fact remains that our future and well-being are tied to that of other countries. The planetization of the nations is being felt first in its uncomfortable aspects. Problems in one part of the world almost immediately create problems worldwide. But as a force for cultural change, this development could just as well nurture a sense of world fellowship. The days of a nation choosing isolationism are over. The planetization of the nations is ultimately a force for transformation that requires a choice between cooperation or suffering. A second force at work upon our world is the decentralization of cities. In other words, there is a trend away from urbanization and a growing new respect for smaller communities as optimal places in which to live. As large urban centers of America, particularly the older cities of Northeast America, decay, we shall be faced with hard choices about rebuilding them. Cultural forces at work point towards smaller and more manageable models for living instead of the urban centralization that has characterized the industrial age. Thompson writes that the miniaturization of technology is a third force for transformation. At first glance, it would seem that technology has been a part of the problem in the old paradigm. We might wonder how a product of technology could constitute a push toward developing a new set of assumptions for living. It is indeed ironic that most remarkable of achievements of the old world order would create an impetus and an aid to a new lifestyle. However, this is exactly the effect that the miniaturization of technology has. Observe what has been made possible by computers or medical equipment, so small they are portable. For example, on his or her laptop, on a plane trip, a business person can now have an information retrieval system as powerful as one that 20 years ago required 1,000 times the space. When the technological tools for living become portable, the decentralization of population centers becomes possible. We no longer have to live in unwieldy urban centers to have access to the technological, medical, and communications resources we need. The miniaturization of these tools for living open up new options in the lifestyle. A final crucial force at work to change our world is the interiorization of consciousness. With this fourth force, as well as the first one, that is the planetization of nations, we find the most direct parallels between cases and Thompson's Millennium Prophecies. As humanity begins to look for the source of the good life within rather than without, value systems begin to shift. A contemplative culture can emerge which finds new meaning in meditation, dream study, mythology, and the arts. In Thompson's view, these four cultural forces work to create a new model for living, what he calls the meta-industrial village. The prefix meta means beyond, so the meta-industrial village is an evolutionary step beyond the lifestyle models of industrial life. The idea of village life may sound like a retrogressive step. It conjures up images of America in the days of George Washington, semi-rural communities with no electricity, no plumbing, no modern communications devices. But Thompson goes to great lengths to explain that this is not his vision at all. Although some proponents of back to nature would like to see us return to an 18th century way of life, he proposes a return to the village scale by incorporating the technological breakthroughs of science. Communities of like-minded people, perhaps several hundred residents per village, can become models for New Age living. Each such meta-industrial village would include 1. Energy self-sufficiency, using a combination of replenishable energy sources such as solar, wood, and wind power. 2. Agricultural self-sufficiency, using organic or biodynamic methods for growing food that respect the delicate ecological balance. 3. Cottage industries for the production of salable goods. Such small-scale production could range from handcrafted furniture to farm implements to microcomputers. The sale of products of the village's cottage industries would provide a source of income or a means of bartering items manufactured in other communities. 4. Education of body, mind, and spirit for village members of all ages. Thompson beautifully describes this ideal in which the entire village would be a contemplative educational community, with its basic way of life being the adventure of consciousness. Everyone living in the community would be involved in an experiential approach to education, from contemplative birth to contemplative death. The concept of the meta-industrial village is the end product of Thompson's theories and visions, and an impressive contribution to speculations about the future. It seems to be quite consistent with the ideals and spirit of Case's perspective on a new, but it is far more detailed and specific in its description than is any lifestyle model proposed in the Case Prophecies. There appears to be no requirement in his vision that everyone live in such a village. We can well imagine that major cities will continue to exist into the 21st century. However, the quality of life and the security to be found in the meta-industrial village would likely attract many people, perhaps a majority, to this new model for living. Visions of a modern mystic. Among the many teachers and psychically sensitive people who have written about a new millennium, David Spangler is a significant contributor. For several years, he served as a formulator of educational development for the spiritual community Findhorn in Scotland. Returning to America, he founded the Lorraine Association and has been active in lecturing and writing about the emergent New World Order. He describes his own method of receiving information on this theme as an attunement to both a universal consciousness and specific non-physical beings in other dimensions of reality. Among Spangler's various books, Revelation, The Birth of a New Age, best expounds his ideas about these times of transition. An essential feature of that book is the notion that a new millennial consciousness is already here, but its current existence is simultaneous with that of the old world. The idea of two worlds may at first sound confusing, but if we look with sensitivity at what is going on within and without us, we may recognize that this is exactly the state of affairs in these changing times. In Spangler's view, a new era is born first in the formative etheric energies of the planet, a level of subtle energy not yet a part of the established scientific worldview. A major shift has already occurred etherically. Nevertheless, the old world's momentum perpetuates its apparent reality and produces a seeming inertia to the change in etheric patterns. For centuries old, world assumptions have guided the creative dimensions of higher realities, which have in turn manifested as the physical world we have known. Even after the creative impulse is removed from these old etheric patterns, they continue to have their effect for some time, but they will necessarily play themselves out. They have within them the seeds of their own demise. An effective yet admittedly distasteful analogy is a chicken whose head has been severed, but who continues lifelike movement for a while. When we take this concept a step further, it suggests to us a strategy for building a new planetary culture. Our forces should not be in conflict with the old. The old world will fail of itself, primarily, Spangler feels, because the creative input at the etheric level no longer exists. Our job is to be a part of the new world, to be attuned to a new consciousness that already exists, and to learn to manifest its reality. Spangler put it this way: to know the new, one must be the new. To engage in conflict with the disintegrating patterns is to be at one with them. just as to use violence to stop violence is to defeat one's essential purpose. The old will separate itself naturally. Revelation, page 170. This philosophy about times of change is certainly found in the Case Millennium Prophecies as well. To those who inquired about how to build a new world, he always responded this way: focus on the positive. In other words, both Case and Spangler point out that by keeping our attention directed toward whatever is helpful and hopeful, we play the most constructive role possible in allowing a new consciousness to emerge on Earth. Conclusions. One of the strongest and most reliable methods of investigation is to search for parallel statements and principles. Corroborative evidence is often the most dependable way to recognize reliable information. In this chapter, we have examined half a dozen independent sources of prophetic wisdom, some dating back many centuries, and some from creative thinkers of our own times. Although certain differences are to be found among these sources and the Case Millennium Prophecies, the large number of parallels is strikingly significant. This comparative approach makes even stronger the conclusion that the Case Millennium Prophecies are worthy of serious consideration. But what is perhaps most impressive from this kind of parallel study is the sense that each of us who is living in these dramatic times of change has an important role to play. To some measure, the future is still being shaped, and we have a say in making the new millennium what it will be. The final two chapters directly address this theme, starting with the idea that Earth changes are as much an internal process as they are an external one.